thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited to be here. I used to be a New Yorker, so it's always a pleasure to return. So I want to talk to you today about messes. I am one of those people that loves helping people to make sense of messes. And as a professional information architect, the people who tend to come to me for help with messes have messes that are so big that they often believe that they're not actually going to be able to be made sense of. So at the beginning of projects with new clients or colleagues, I often feel like we are kind of like playing a game of chicken, where they keep adding complexity, and I keep taking it like, okay, yeah, I can handle that. And they're like, oh yeah? Well, we've got 3 CRM systems. And I'm like, bring it. And they're like, oh yeah? Well, we've got 5 languages that we got to deal with. And I'm like, ooh, that sounds fun. So it's not always the most popular stance, but I really like when things are messy. It gives me an opportunity to flex the skills that information architecture has given me. So these are some of the pictures of typical messes that I've helped to make sense of recently. And I know that these pictures might be dismissed as just a pile of Post-its. It's a little bit of designer theater. When you see designers, they often have Post-its. And in fact, I will admit, these are just piles of Post-its. But more importantly, these Post-its actually represent the hopes and fears of the people who are working on projects or on different services that I've worked on. These Post-it notes are actually a really important cognitive tool that allow us to dig into complexity and to start to move forward. So I spend a lot of time helping teams to make sense and then sort through big, messy piles of Post-its. And I am deeply aware that not everyone has the want or the stomach to deal with messes. But that doesn't change the fact that most of us, if not all of us, especially those of us working to deliver quality user experiences, face messes that we must make sense of. In fact, if you think about it, the world is messier now than it has ever been before. And even scarier to think on is that tomorrow, the messes that exist today will be even more messy. Because like broken windows in bad neighborhoods or barnacles on ships, with time, messes only get messier. So there's this material that's to blame for most of these messes that we face. And this material is not new to the digital world. In fact, it's as old as humanity is. Yet it's one that you're probably asked to deal with more and more every day. This material is called information. And the tough thing about understanding information is that it's not like the other materials that we're taught to use, like brick or glass or even pixels. Information is a much sketchier material to grasp. And it's because it's not like those other physical materials that we've gotten used to wrangling. This is because information can be found in the lack of physical material as easily as in the presence of it. In fact, information only exists in the heads of those that are interpreting our work. And I know that that can start to sound a little bit like freshman philosophy class. It's a little hippy-dippy, but bear with me for just a second. So I want to take the example from this picture of bakery case. Now, many of you encountering this bakery case might make the decision that the oatmeal cookies are less desirable or purchased less often than the double chocolate chip cookies, because there are more oatmeal cookies than there are double chocolate chip. Many of you might also agree that there has likely at some point been more than that one double chocolate chip cookie on that plate. But how do you actually know? Did you see the other cookies? Do you know for a fact that those cookies were ever there? Now, you might be thinking, well, that sounds a little bit kooky. Everything I know about cookies is that you don't bake them in rounds of 1. So obviously, there must have been other cookies on that plate. But in reality, you're assuming those things so that you can go on with your day. And you likely don't even know that you're assuming those things, even though these assumptions will affect what cookie you might feel like in this moment. This subconscious consideration of options and interpretations of our surroundings is the only way to keep us from literally curling up in a ball of indecision and tears 2 minutes after getting out of bed in the morning. Our brains have to fill the holes in what we see, and we have to tell ourselves stories about what is true so we can move on with our lives. It's just cookies. So we experience millions of these moments every day. And like this example in the bakery case, it's a perfect example of how this arrangement of content combined with the subjective data that we all individually have access to affects the information that we individually create. 2 users of this bakery case can walk away with 2 very different views on the exact same user experience. The same content begets a multitude of information. One person might walk away believing that oatmeal raisin is much less popular, while someone else could believe that double chocolate chip cookie is much less fresh. So truth actually has no place here. So the moral of this story is that truth doesn't matter as much as perception does. And I know that that's a very controversial statement to make in 2018 with everything that's going on. But information is individual to the person that's doing the perceiving. This means that we can't make information, no matter how hard we try. We can only make content and hope that that content is going to leave what we intend in terms of what people believe after consuming it. Our users make the information. And this is not just the fact of bakery cases. This happens with everything that we make for others to experience. So when I talk to my colleagues and my clients and my students about information architecture, this is what I try to get across. Information architecture is a practice of deciding how to arrange something to support a very specific intention. And information architecture is not directions for how something should look, but instead how it's intended to be perceived. So with the time that I have with you all today, I want to share with you 3 lessons that I've learned as an information architect. And I think that these are the most helpful when getting started in making sense of whatever messes you might have in the experience that you're working on now. So our first lesson is that language matters. Now, I find this to be an incredibly obvious statement to most, and yet it is the hardest lesson for most organizations to actually turn into practice. I recently worked with a product team where there were 14 terms and phrases for the same thing. Now, it is really important to note early in that story that no one would ever sit down and say, let's think of 14 ways to say the same damn thing. Instead, this is something that happens in different silos, in different groups, over time, and then it ends up in one user experience. One group decides to call it a clip, the other lands on the word highlight, a third adds the word video, and 11 others decide something entirely different sounds right for their purposes. This is the single most common ailment that I see in information architectures that I've worked on. There's this concept called linguistic insecurity, and it occurs when we don't feel like we're understanding the language that someone is using, and our users experience this when our products don't speak in the same ways that they understand. Our colleagues experience this too, when someone from the technology team, for example, is starting to speak something to the marketing team, maybe. Maybe that'll happen. So these linguistic issues within a product are impactful not just to those who work on the product itself, but also to those that manage the customer service calls, create marketing campaigns, and conduct quality assurance activities. Because often, when people have so many ways to say the same thing, they start to think that there are, in fact, more than one thing that's being described. Suddenly, it's not just a label difference, it's a model difference. And it ends up as a scope creep in functionality that's being developed, or it ends up being in the navigation taxonomy, or it ends up as a different table in the database. So language can be really overwhelming as a topic to tackle in its entirety. And many companies that I've worked with seem to live in a very adjective-centric world. We talk about things being useful and usable and beautiful and intuitive and innovative. And these are important descriptive words when thinking about a product, but these words can also be quite hard to hang functionality off of. So to start thinking about language, I like to ask a team to focus on the nouns first. The objects are a good foundation to get us focused on the sense-making that we need to do. So I want you to think just for a second about how many nouns you're dealing with in your product. Now, I want you to think about whether or not any of them are actually synonyms for other words that you also use, maybe in other parts of your organization. And then I want you to think, how would your world be different if those were all reconciled? So this needless duplication happens to nouns as much as it does to verbs, and it's important to consider both. For example, you might see edit used in one part of an experience and then modify used elsewhere. And there are hundreds of common examples like this. And each of those choices of label matter in how clear something ends up being for your users to experience. So to clean up a mess like this, you need to mine for nouns and verbs and determine on a case-by-case basis whether you're dealing with a label change or if, in fact, a model change is warranted. The product team that I mentioned earlier with the 14 terms for the same one thing was facing the reality that they needed to translate their product into 5 languages. You all can do that math. That is a scary mess. By considering which were duplicative in terms of model differences and removing those labels that were really repeating others, we were able to reduce the number of terms significantly and start to remove all of the code and interfaces that were being maintained and supported in those other pieces of language that were no longer necessary. Now, about this time, usually some folks in the audience are starting to think, but what? What do you mean? Like, do you need to come up with one word for every one thing in a user experience? Now, the answer to that is not always. So please understand that streamlining to just one label per model is not actually always the best direction. In many cases, with different contexts or different users, we might have more than one label for the same model. The important thing is to understand that something is just a label change, so that duplicative models aren't developed and then later maintained. And the goal is just to understand what you mean when you say what you say. It's not always about simplification. It's much more about clarity. So the tool that creates agreement among people about what things mean and what things are called is called controlled vocabulary. It's not complicated and it's not technical to develop, but it is time-consuming, and I admit it is not the sexiest diagram or document to look at. This is just a list of words with definitions and rules of usage. But the power behind this list is that it is the list. No one is allowed to go against the list without changing the list by agreement with others. So I think it's important to think about language and to talk about language as one of the building materials that's shared across all functions of your business, because experiences are made of language. And there is an incredible opportunity for most teams to think about how their choices of language may be cumbersome for users to understand or for teams to maintain and support. And in my experience, every organization has these semantic dragons, whether they be legacy terms or internal language that confuses users or jargon that's been inherited by an industry or a context. And the clarification of these words can have a major difference in almost any organization. So language is all around us, and without rules on how we can use that language consistently, those semantic dragons will reign free and terrorize your proverbial villagers. So this idea might seem simple enough to not even be needed at all, but I have literally had clients and colleagues hug me on delivery of a controlled vocabulary document, which is a little weird. It's often noted as the single most important thing that I can deliver as an information architect, because it gives the team something to point to in determining what they mean when they say what they say. So our second lesson is there is no right way. I want to clue you in on a little secret. I am not actually an expert on organizing things the right way. I am an expert in getting people to agree on their way of organizing things. And this means that if you ask me a question about how to organize something, I will almost always answer with, it depends on what you want to accomplish. So let me give you an example. Let's say that we're working on a grocery product. And after some research into how people categorize produce, we determined that tomatoes, squash, avocados, and eggplant are not easily discovered by users when classified as fruit, which, by the way, is how science classifies them. So we decide, as Fresh Direct and Walmart have here, to classify them instead as vegetables. Now you see, in most contexts, the taxonomy that we choose is much more a tool of rhetoric than exact science. I like this example because a scientific way does in fact exist. It just doesn't serve these products to obey those standards. So think for a second about the impact to sales and findability if the teams working on these products had insisted on adhering to Linnaean taxonomic standards. No one would be able to find anything. But now, let's say that we're instead organizing a teaching tool for middle school students to learn about the classification of plant life. In this case, to store all of those fruits masquerading as vegetables would be doing us a disservice because it would be against our intention of teaching. So the way you organize your produce actually says a lot about you and your intention. So simply stated, there is no one right way to organize anything. And it turns out that the organization of things is only correct insofar as it helps you to reach the intention that you've set for whatever it is that you're making. This means that some websites are actually architected to get you to pick up the phone, and some mobile apps are architected to get you to go to the desktop. And some buildings are architected to get you to leave quickly. This may seem contrary to our ideas of what a good experience is, but it highlights an important idea, which is that the taxonomy that you choose for organizing something is actually one of the most powerful tools that we have of rhetoric. It's a decision to be made, not something that just is, that should be taken for granted for or inherited from other circumstances. So the trick to seeing taxonomy as a tool of rhetoric is to get people to organize their whatever at least 2 ways before we decide how to proceed. So if they're currently organizing things by department, I try to have them do it by task or audience or topic instead. And this is a process of letting go of what we sometimes can assume is the only way that we might be able to organize something. Once we think of a new way, we can decide whether or not that taxonomy gets us to our intent more fully. This is also the point where getting users involved is often the key to unlocking the best way forward. If your team hasn't tried research activities like card sorting and tree testing, I highly recommend them as generative exercises when trying to figure out those alternative ways to organize your product. The key is getting people to let go of there only being one way and to open up the possibility of new and better ways so that we can find an alternative way of showing something. And our third lesson, we need pictures. It has been my experience time and time again that without something to point to, people will just flounder in indecision, or even worse, they will schedule yet another meeting to hash it out. You all have been in these meetings. Maybe you've been in one already today. I have watched teams waste hours. I have watched teams waste days. I have watched teams waste months, even years, not making progress because everyone was talking with their hands about something in a meeting and no one was drawing a picture and picking up the pen. That picture is literally sometimes the elephant in the room. And taking notes is not enough. We often need pictures to make progress. As simple as it seems, making pictures of things allows us to get on the same page, and we can adjust our mental models accordingly. And I'm not just talking about wireframes and sitemaps and flow diagrams. In fact, often the decisions that we need to make are obfuscated by jumping to drawing the solution to an underdefined problem. Instead, I'm talking about pictures that allow us to discuss complex things without relying on other people to keep up with their heads alone. So today, I'm going to share with you a couple of lessons that are very specific to pictures that I've learned over time. The first one is take the time and space that's needed to actually collect and iterate on the diagrams that you're making. I have been in far too many meetings where someone has exhaustedly tried to get through a really important decision in like a half-day workshop, and everyone leaves exhausted, and you might feel like you got agreement, but really it was just you bullied them into agreeing so that everybody could leave the room and like go home to their real life. And then the next day you come in and they kind of are like, hey, I don't really feel comfortable about what happened yesterday, and they start poking holes through it, and the next thing you know, you're doing the whole thing over again, right? So instead, we have to admit to that complexity. We need to take the time and the space that might be needed to collect over time the data we need to make sure the diagram is right. So this is an example from some work that I did a few years back with Nike. And this diagram took 3 months and a war room wrapped in craft paper to get through. But it was worth it. If I had tried to accomplish drawing that diagram in just like a 1 workshop session or even a week-long intensive sprint, I probably could have done it, but it would have been wrong. And that's really the problem with kind of rushing things and going too fast. The next lesson that I've learned is that if you can visualize something that's hard to explain, you can actually make progress with folks. Sometimes there's these things that are so complex to understand that it literally stops us dead in our tracks when we're trying to make decisions around it. The process that I was working on a diagram for Nike was a really good example of that. It was a 96-week production process that no one had ever seen a picture of. And the only thing anyone could agree on across the organization was that it was, in fact, 96 weeks. Now, when it came to what happened on week 80 versus week 72, no agreement whatsoever, which was kind of the problem. Now, they had operated like this for a really long time, and the intention that came forward was that they needed to build software to help with this process, and in order to do so, they needed to actually know what the process was and have a shared understanding of it. So I drew this diagram to simplify something that was really complex to understand so that everyone could get around the campfire of agreement and we could move forward as a team. And this diagram was super well received. Like, this was something that I was so proud of myself as an information architect. I was like, dang, I'm kind of good at my job. This is great. You guys, I kind of messed this up. So there's a really big flaw in this diagram, which is that in a 96-week process, Nike is not focused on one season. They're focused on many seasons stacked up on top of each other, and they're in a different part of this 96-week process for each one of those seasons. So I republished the diagram. Wait for it. Not so simple. But it's inspiring realistic instead of simplistic thinking. And that really made a difference to the team. All of a sudden, the conversations that I was starting to hear, which were pretty scary, about making software that was really like, step one, welcome to week one. In week one, you will accomplish these things. Welcome to week two. When we started looking through this diagram's lens, all of a sudden, they realized that that would be real weird, because you'd log in and it would be like, welcome to week one, welcome to week 14, welcome to week 22, depending on the season that they were in. So we have to be careful of reductionism. So I want to ask you about this diagram, and I want you to pretend for just a second that you are an alien from outer space that has never encountered pizza before. I know, can you imagine not knowing what pizza is? Amazing. Now, imagine that I gave you this diagram as an alien from outer space, and I asked you to make pizza using this diagram. Where would you put the tomato sauce in relationship to the cheese? Would you put the tomato sauce on top of the cheese? I see you, Chicago. That's really freaking weird. So we can all admit that there are flaws with this diagram for the purpose of instruction for how to build a pizza. Now I want you to think about how this diagram relates to static comps and wireframes that we often share with partners that are meant to be building what it is we are designing. Be careful of reductionism. Where we do not have clarity and agreement amongst ourselves, we will often make shit up. And sometimes you're not going to like the shit that other people make up about your work. So this is a time where we need to show the process and not just the results. And an exploded schematic is a really good way for us to solve the problem of our aliens from outer space friends learning the beauty that is pizza. So here's the trick to knowing if a picture is actually needed. If you're ever having a conversation with someone or you're in a meeting when someone is using their hands to describe something that they're talking about, they are drawing a diagram in their head. And you should make it your business to get that diagram out of their head as quickly as possible and onto a piece of paper or whiteboard so that everyone can see it and understand it, and that you can add your own perspective lens to the mix. It might not actually look the way that you're expecting it to once you get it all out of their heads. And in my experience, these simple pictures can release frustration and eliminate arguments. So have everyone draw what they see in their heads and then compare them with each other. If you have one picture that everyone can agree on, you get everyone to draw, you get all of that agreement, you can really move forward. The intention of these pictures is actually to change. So don't be protective of them. This is not about creating a shiny object at your desk alone and then showing it off in a meeting and being like, look at how good I am at drawing diagrams. These pictures are meant to be working tools that are places for us to work out and acknowledge that complexity together. So keep it messy. So once we have a picture, once we have something that we can point to, we can actually reach agreement. And only when we have agreement can we actually move forward. Without agreement, we will all continue to linger in that sea of indecision and assumptions and more meetings than any of us actually want to attend. So make a picture of that monster that's in everybody's head, that complex thing that no one can quite grasp. Sometimes that simple picture can have them be like the aha moment that they can actually move forward. One other little hint that I've learned over the years, the person who picks up the marker owns the project. So if you're looking for the moment to step up at your job, be the one who isn't afraid to draw the monster in everyone's head. stand up at that whiteboard and put one dot on there and watch the agreement come. So I hope that you're walking away with 3 key lessons about information architecture. The first is that we need to know what we mean when we say what we say. So make sure that you're talking about language in your organization. And I know that talking about language seems super meta and really uncomfortable, but it's super important work. The second thing that we talked about is there's no right way to organize anything. There's only the way that's going to get us to our intent. So show an alternative way of organizing something. And lastly, making simple pictures of complex things is the key to agreement. So make a picture of the monster in everyone's head. Lastly, I also hope that these steps don't feel like something that you need a specialist to take care of, because information architecture is not just for information architects. It's an important practice to understand if you're making anything for other people. So before I leave you, I want to ask a favor of everyone in this room. Please, please help the world be a clearer place by spreading the words information architecture to as many people as possible. Without a name for this important practice, people can't get better at it. And it is my belief and hope that if more people understand the importance of these lessons, we can collectively make the world a better place and a less messy one. And with that, I'd love to take some questions.